Today we're going to be talking about 100% congregation involvement. Yes, it's possible. That's the title of our webinar today. And my name is Charlie Holt, and with me is Alan White.
Hi there.
And I'm the author of the Christian Life Trilogy and the rector of St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Lake Mary, Florida. And Alan, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I have been pastor for 25 years and have done a lot with small groups, have worked most of the last 12 years for Life Together Ministries, which started out of Saddleback Church, and currently am a church consultant and work with churches in a variety of ways and helped with the development of the Christian Life Trilogy about a year ago, and I'm happy to be here.
Great, thank you. My little clicker's not working. A couple of things that we're going to be working on today is the idea of launching small groups at 100% of your average Sunday attendance. And just to give a sense, when we talk about 100%, yes, that's possible, 100% participation. What we're talking about is that it is possible to get 100% of your average Sunday attendance connected and engaged in a small group ministry. And so just to give a number, if your church has 100 people that come on a weekend, it is possible to have 100 people involved in small groups. And Alan and I have both seen this many, many times over our ministries, and we'd love to talk with you about how that is accomplished. And the same is true of a church that has 1,000 people that come on a weekend, or even 10,000. It's possible to have 10,000 people engaged in small groups for a church that has 10,000 people coming on a weekend. So let me ask you a question, Alan. You know, I have the space shuttle here. I know we've decommissioned the space shuttle. That's not. I don't want to go too far down that road. But I think a lot of our churches. This is a very Florida icon here, but a lot of our churches are sitting on the launch pad and really poised to do some big things, but they just need a little encouragement. So why would you say we need to launch big?
I think because it's easy to launch small. It's easy to have a measurable goal, and you don't know what you really could have done until you have that goal that's it makes it over the top for you. And for every church, that's going to be a little bit different. But what is that thing that seems almost impossible? And I kind of equated, in my own experience, back to Roger Bannister when no one thought it was humanly possible to break the 4-minute mile. And so they thought it was a physical limitation, and what it ended up being was actually a mental limitation. And once Roger Bannister was able to break that 4-minute mile, there were a number of other people that followed immediately right after him and were able to also break the 4-minute mile, because then they knew that it was possible. And so in churches I work with, across North America, as well as churches I've served in, and including St. Peter's with you, Charlie, to see some things that were just, phenomenal. And I don't know that I would have ever believed that a church of 260 people could have had 70 small groups until I saw that happen at St. Peter's.
Alan, one of the things, your audio is a little choppy, and maybe that you're having some kind of technical thing there, or feedback.
Could be.
One of the things that you mentioned, St. Peter's, and it was something that really surprised us when we went through it. But back in 2004, you'll remember that Rick Warren launched what was a very famous small group program called the 40 Days of Purpose, based on the Purpose Driven Life book. And this is really where my horizons got expanded on small group ministry. Is we set a goal to have a lot of small groups for our church. We had about 240 people coming to our church at the time, and at that, with Rick Warren's encouragement, he challenged us to do what was called set an exponential goal. And what he said was add a 0 to whatever number you were planning. So we were planning to have 10 small groups And when we took his counsel and added a 0, that would mean at our church with 250 average Sunday attendance, we would have 100 small groups and 1,000 people taking the course with us and participating. And that was something that we got excited about, but it became a very big challenge for us. And what I'll tell you, just the short end of the story is, we didn't end up hitting 100 small groups, but what we did accomplish was we got to a point where we had 70 small groups participating in the 40 Days of Purpose campaign. And 65% of the people that participated with us in the 40 Days of Purpose campaign were not members of our church. We added 30 new families to our congregation that year, and it really changed the way I look at the way that small groups can fit into the life of a congregation. And the really neat thing about the small group experience is that we thought, well, that was just a one-time thing, that Rick Warren's book and he was famous and that kind of thing. But we have been able to replicate, not at that level, but we have consistently gotten 100% of our average Sunday attendance connected to small groups every time we've really set our mind to do that. And as we have launched multiple different small group programs and campaigns over the years, we've found that we can consistently connect 100% of our average Sunday attendance. Alan, talk about the gap that we often experience between worship and discipleship.
Yeah, I think what often happens with churches is that their worship attendance is going to outpace discipleship attendance. And, you know, my concern in this is that if people are coming on the weekend and they're not connected in another way, they're not attending a class, they're not doing a midweek Bible study, a women's Bible study, or a small group, my question is, while they can obviously gain from the weekend worship service, where are they growing and where are they connecting with other believers? Because sooner or later, you know, something's going to come up in somebody's life and they're going to need help, whether it's making a decision or whether it's overcoming some kind of a crisis. And so where's the help going to, you know, originate from in the congregation? And often it falls back on the clergy to fill in that gap. And yet as congregations become larger and larger, it's harder to make that time available. Not that it isn't a priority, just out of necessity. And yet if people are connected into a group, then they have an immediate place to go to for care and for help, and also to help and to serve other people, which in itself is an exercise in growing spiritually.
That's exactly what I've found. And when you get to particular sizes as a congregation where you have several hundred people coming to worship, it gets to be to a point where a pastor cannot connect with every single person in the life of the congregation. And so pastoral care needs to be done on a one-to-one basis, and those small groups help create that loving community and feel. So, and it also becomes a way to engage the entire congregation in discipleship as well. When I do a midweek class at the church, the most I'll ever get is about a quarter of our average Sunday attendance, and that's on a really good class, you know. So, but when we do these small group programs and we meet at different times, different locations, we can get 100% of our average attendance in a small group. One of the things, if you're joining the webinar, and I see we've gotten a good number of participants now, is that there's a couple of ways that you can ask us questions, and probably the easiest is to use the chat function. You can send a chat to us and ask a question, and we can respond to that as we see those. So I do encourage you to give us some feedback or raise questions. If there's something that we said that's unclear, go ahead and use that chat function and let us know what you're thinking, because we'd love to have some interaction as we're going through this. So a couple of things at groups, we've already talked about a lot of these things, but groups bridge the gap of increased connection, pastoral fellowship, the discipleship need. How do small groups increase attendance and volunteerism and giving, Alan?
You know, these aren't just examples of wishful thinking. These actually came out of research that was done by Eric Geiger and his companion that I'm not thinking of right now, but the book's right here on the shelf, Ed Stetzer at Lifeway Research, president of Lifeway Research, in a book called Transformational Groups, as well as some research that was done a while back by Robert Wuthnow in his book called Sharing the Journey. And so academically, this has been studied. People have looked at the research, and then also anecdotally through churches that I've had the privilege of working with over the last 10, 12 years. But to find that there is increased connection as people are spending time with each other, getting to know each other. And, and this is a function that's necessary not just in a large church, but in any size church. Because the people coming in, they're not all going to have a personal relationship with the senior pastor or maybe even with a staff member, but as long as they're connected to somebody, as long as they know somebody that they can spend regular time with and then also to grow with, but also the attendance piece. And attendance can come one of two ways. One is that we found that the participation during a series is higher than participation during other seasons of the year, because what they're studying in their groups is also being taught on the weekend. And because of that connection, they're more likely to attend the weekend service because of what they're studying in that group the next week. There's also a bit of accountability there, because it used to be that if they attended worship and if they missed worship, well, then who noticed? But if there are groups, sitting together, or they'll say, I didn't see you on Sunday. Is everything okay? And there's a little bit of accountability built in. The other way that this helps to increase attendance is that sometimes people will invite their friends, their neighbors, people that maybe infrequently attend church to be part of their group. And those folks, you say, oh, by the way, this is being taught on the weekend as well. Would you like to come to church with me? And then serving as well as giving. I have a church that I've been working with this last year in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area. And they did a comparison of the first 6 months of 2014 and the first 6 months of 2015. And side by side, the only thing they did different was they've done 2 church-wide studies that align with the weekend services. And they found that they've had an increase in attendance of 7.5% over the same time period last year, and they've had an increase of giving by 7% over the same time period last year. And that's not an insignificant thing. I mean, if a church, say, has, I'll use even numbers because it makes the math easier for me. If you have $1 million budget, you increase 7%, that's $70,000. And that could be, a staff position or a new boat if you live in Florida or something like that, right?
We don't have a church boat. But what I've just seen it practically happen in my own small group, where we had a friend of ours that we invited to be part of our small group. And it was somebody that worked out with my wife at the exercise class. And the next thing you know, she's attending church with her husband. Her husband started attending our small group. And then kind of like glue, they invited a friend to the small group and now to church as well. So just from our small group, we've gained 3 new members just because we invited a friend to be a part of the group. So it does work. So part of why we're going through some of that is to get to the why of why we want to really get to the point of having that many people engaged in small groups in the life of a congregation. And it really fundamentally comes down to that kind of transformational growth that we want to see in people's lives.
Yeah, and this is very true. And you have to ask yourself, what are you ready to do? Do you want transformational growth, or do you want incremental growth as far as numbers, as far as even how people are growing individually as believers? And I would say even what you were saying earlier, Charlie, about you thought for 40 Days of Purpose that maybe you would have about 10 groups, and then you added the 0 to the end and shot for 100. Well, if your goal was 10 groups, even though you didn't get to 100, if your goal was 10 groups, I doubt that you would have gotten to 70.
That's right.
You know, but with 100, you know, you say, oh, it's a failure. We were 30 groups short of our goal. No, absolutely not. To have 70 is tremendous. And so I think that thing of how do we aim higher? How do we go further than we think? And sometimes we think, well, you know, I need to have these well-qualified leaders that I know personally and this, that, and the other. And you can do that. And it will lead to more incremental growth as far as getting people connected into groups. But when we say, well, let's build a team, and then that small group team is going to help, you know, recruit folks, train folks who are perhaps, we know them, perhaps we don't know them as well, but we can get to know them. And that begins to kind of unleash this a little bit and take it to a different place than it might have been.
Absolutely. And you know, as a pastor, I know that a lot of clergy sometimes get a lot of pressure to get, you know, more people in the pews and more financial. The most important thing that you want to see is that life change and transformational growth and personal relationships and depth of spiritual commitment and faith. That's really where it's all about. And when you go after that, you actually get the other as a side benefit, more people, more dollars. This is a quote that you like, Alan. What is this one saying to you?
Well, here's what it says to me. My name is Alan, and I am a recovering control freak. And I really did have a lot of control of my groups early on. But, you know, I came across this line, and it's not, you know, the exact words of Rick, but it's the spirit of what he said, that you can structure for control or you can structure for growth, but you can't do both. And so when I found that I was heavily leaning on the control side, I found that the growth was not as regular, it wasn't as big as I had hoped it could have been, but I did have control. And once I began to release control, try some things that at the time I felt was risky by, you know, developing a team, by inviting people to gather friends, to do a study, and maybe I didn't know them as well, but I had a team who was getting to know them. We found that our growth went in a lot of different directions. And it was, you know, it wasn't really my senior pastor, it wasn't the church, it wasn't the material, it was me trying to, you know, keep a heavy hand on the whole process and what was going on. And once I began to release that and allow other people to use their gifts, allow other people to become involved, and it didn't all revolve around me, then growth became very steady. Now, were there problems along the way? Yes, there were problems along the way, but we addressed our problems. And it's not like, oh, we tried some new strategies and got people connected to groups, and then all of a sudden we had all of these problems. The reality is the problems are already out there. We just found out about the problems so we could do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I've noticed just in my own need to control is I like seeing people on the church campus. And one of the things that happens whenever we do a small group campaign, and we have a lot of people out there in groups meeting in homes, I don't know what's happening because I'm not seeing it. And that there's something inside of me that feels out of control with that, where I know that something good is happening in the congregation, but because it's not happening in a classroom with me teaching it, that feels out of control to me. But I do resonate with the quote in that way, because you can't do the kind of, at least most facilities can't accomplish getting 100% of their average Sunday attendance meeting in small groups on their facility on one given night. You've got to utilize other facilities, and the biggest asset that many of our members have is their homes, and that's a great way to get them involved in ministry. So let's talk about a goal, creating a goal for a congregation. This is a little simple formula that we use in our church. Is if you have an average weekend attendance at St. Peter's, we have 350 people that come. Just divide that by 8. Now, don't ask me to divide 350 by 8 off the top of my head, but it's, you know, around 30 groups is, you know, 25 to 30 groups is no, more than that. It'd be about 40 groups, I think. See, that's pastor math for you. But if you do it by 10, it's easier. 350 divided by 10 is 35 groups. And that would be, you know, a goal of the number of groups that you might need. This works whether you have a church of 1,000 people or whether you have a church of 100 people. I want to play a little video clip of 43.75. Thank you for helping me out. Here's a clip on with a couple of pastors or a couple of campaign leaders thinking about the goals that they were going to set.
And for the given size of our church, we initially thought 20 would be achievable small groups to attain, but we want to shoot high. So we said we're going to get 40 small group host leaders. And you know what happened? We ended up with 30 small group hosts, and that was just fantastic.
We started off to say if we could get 100 people to participate in this, it would be a dynamic study for us in our church. We ended up with about 140 to 150 to complete the course. So it was well worth our time and really was something that the whole church was able to participate in one way or another.
Those two that were speaking there were people that had just completed a program called the Christian Life Trilogy, which is one of the things that we want to tell you about while we're here. But they were planning for the Crucified Life program, and one of the things that I like about that clip is that you had one that set a bigger goal than what they actually accomplished. But because it was such a big goal, 40 groups, they were happy when they got to 30 groups, because the original goal that they were initially discussing was 20. And then the other pastor, he planned a little more conservatively, but it was still a big goal, 100 participants participating. That might be 12 or 13 groups. And for that size congregation, I know the size of his church, that was close to 100% of his people participating. And when all was said and done, he ended up finished with people that were 140, 150 people participating in his program, and he felt good about that. So I like the idea that, you know, these whether you set a conservative goal or you set something that's a little challenging, even more than what you would think, both of those small group campaign coordinators were very excited about the results they got. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, I think again, you know, setting the goal that's higher than what you might think is possible, you will gain more than maybe you originally had expected. But it's not just, you know, numbers for the sake of numbers. The church I attend has a saying, and it says every number has a name, every name has a story, and every story matters to God. And so what's going on in the lives of people? I mean, no church, regardless of, I work with churches as small as 40 people, as large as 40,000. And what I find is no church has the luxury of having enough staff to care for all of the pastoral needs of every member of the congregation. And so I think to begin to set goals, begin to think in these terms of how are we going to provide care for people? How are we going to help them to grow spiritually? How are we going to make sure that they're connected to somebody else? Are very important goals to set. We were talking about control earlier, and one of the thoughts that came to mind that after I kind of, you know, relinquished control of what were the qualifications to lead a group and who could lead a group, and every church needs to make that decision for themselves. What I really came down to was, because I didn't know what was going on in those homes, or I didn't know what was going on in those classrooms, it really came down to I had control of two things. One was I was determining what curriculum that they were going to study. And the second was I was giving them an experienced leader or a staff member or someone that I knew well as their coach. And so I had the curriculum and the coaching, and if we knew what they were studying, we knew more about who was doing the groups, then that led to, something pretty amazing. So when you get to the 50, in this case with a church of 400, that may seem like an impossible task. I've had a church of 50 people, have 100 people in groups, and have found things like this work. And a lot of it really depends on what is that number, not an egotistical thing, but what is that number that's going to stretch your faith that you can trust God for, and to begin to think, how can we get our people connected? How can we get people more involved in being a part of the regular life of this congregation? How can we bring people in who maybe have never even darkened the door of the church, and yet they're comfortable in their friend's living room? And so to begin to think in these terms, the numbers seem ridiculous, but it really is amazing by, trusting in faith that these kinds of things can be accomplished. It's really amazing where you can end up going.
Right. And I have a heart for the small congregations, and a church that has 40 people that come on a weekend, what would 5 small groups do for a church of that size? If you were to engage 50 people in the life of that church in a small group, or 40 people in a small group, that could change the dynamics of that small congregation, where they have a much more family feel, more engagement, and it could really set it on a strong path. The same dynamic, the larger you get, the more you need to get smaller. But if you have 4,000 people, and we have people that have signed up for this webinar that are in both categories, some that are vicars of small churches, and some that are the larger congregations that have the multiple thousands of people that come on a weekend. Getting 500 people in groups may seem like an insurmountable task, but for a church that size, they're able to put the infrastructure in place to make that happen and to accomplish that. A church that has 40 people coming on a weekend, it may seem insurmountable to have 5 small groups going, but it's not really at all. We're only talking about 5 host homes to host that small group. And I think any pastor could probably come up with 5 families that have the gift of hospitality to open up their homes to host a small group. And you could probably think of it in a few minutes if you really put your mind to it. But one of the key things about such a big goal, and this is just a fundamental principle, is that if you're going to have 50 groups for a church that's 400 ASA, 50 group leaders, then one of the key things is you need to get your senior pastor. In my tradition, the Episcopal Church, we call it the rector, but you need to have the senior pastor involved and engaged in the program, don't you?
Yeah, because I found in a lot of churches, and we've worked with, Episcopal churches all the way. I think the other extreme, I got permission to say this, is like vineyard churches. That's the other extreme. And everybody else in between. But what we found is if people aren't connected to each other, the reason that they attend Sunday morning is because of the senior pastor, because of the rector or the person who's teaching on a regular basis. They resonate with their style. They like the sermons, they like the sense of humor and everything else. And I usually tell people, don't say anything to your worship pastor because this is going to break his heart. But it really is that senior leader. And so when the senior leader stands up and says, if you would be willing to do this, we are going to help you, and I would encourage you to do this, they're going to take that leadership, and they're going to take this to heart and to say, well, the materials seem to be fairly easy to do because as a qualified teacher, I don't need to be a Bible teacher. I don't need to lead the group. I just need to play the video, go through the questions, invite some friends, and be warm and hospitable. And that really is the requirement. And then the church is going to help me. And again, that kind of invitation really comes from the senior leader in the church. You could have someone else maybe that's tasked with small groups to try to handpick leaders, try to recruit. I did that. I had a 5-year plan. I was going to get everybody in groups in 5 years. And when I was 7 years into my 5-year plan, I decided that it was time to abandon it, try something else. And we did a curriculum, church-wide series similar to what we were describing. And my senior pastor got up and introduced that to the congregation. we actually doubled our groups in a day, and it had taken 7 years to get where we were. But it really was that influence of the senior pastor being involved and being willing to promote the series.
I've heard it said many times that, and as a pastor, you cannot delegate vision. You can delegate a lot of things, but the one thing that you can't delegate is being the one that speaks the vision to the congregation. The people that are following your lead, they need to hear that you believe in something and that it's going to be something that you're going to put your support behind. Because if they, and that goes for anything, whether you're talking about a capital campaign or you're talking about a new initiative or program in the life of the church, it doesn't necessarily take all of the pastor's time, but what it does take is a pastor's commitment and willingness to speak to it from the front. Some senior pastors aren't always sold on the idea of small groups, and I wonder if you'd speak to that, Alan.
Yeah, and there's a variety of reasons. I've seen some pastors that didn't really want to promote groups. And in fact, I had one pastor that told me outright, well, I don't want to stand up there and beg. And I thought, man, you're not begging, you're leading. Come on, man. Some pastors feel like if they promote groups, that means they have to join a group, and they don't want to join a group. And then some would say, well, isn't that why I hired a small group director? Isn't that why I hired a small group pastor? Isn't that your job to get people into groups? And then some pastors have shown that they're, maybe not as interested in groups. And so there are some ways, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But so, Charlie, let me pose this question to you. You are a rector. You are a senior leader in church. How did you interest yourself so greatly in small groups?
Well, I do think that I personally have natural barriers to big new initiatives because it's a risk, and if I put myself out there as a senior pastor and it flops, then I don't want that to be reflective of something that I really encourage people to, and that's just insecurity sometimes that I feel. But my conversion to small groups mainly came because I just saw what happened in the life of our church as we got to the level of having a church-wide small group program, and I saw the life change that was taking place. I saw the transformation of people's lives, and once that happened, I was sold. And I think that's the key thing to emphasize. If you're a small group champion or pastor in the life of your church, or you're the discipleship director, and your senior pastor is a little hesitant about your zeal, try to find out what your senior pastor is concerned about. And pretty much it's this list right here. The senior pastor is going to be interested in pastoral support of the membership, deeper fellowship, growing the members, discipleship, seeing attendance increased, increased serving, all the things that we've already talked about before. But I can guarantee you, as a senior pastor, when I started to see new families joining our church, I get excited about it. When I start to see people getting connected and in and out of each other's homes, doing some of the pastoral care work that I would have been responsible for, but they're doing it, and loving on each other better than I could ever accomplish, those are the kind of things that really get my heart excited in the ministry. And it's starting to that's the vision that has to be cast. You have to get to the interest of what your senior pastor or your rector is, and find out what they're passionate about, and connect that to the vision of what you're trying to accomplish in launching 100% of your campaign into small groups. Let me show I want to get to some of the practical things, and again, if you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. If there's something that's interesting you here or we're not touching on it, please speak a comment or a question into the chat, and we'll address it as we go. I'm going to show another video clip, and the idea here is one of the things about having a large goal, like anything else that's a new initiative or a big initiative in the life of a church, you really do have to give yourself time to develop a process. And so I want to shift gears and think more practically about that. So let me play this clip, and then we'll get to some of your questions.
We started about 4 months before we launched. It gave us the time as a leadership to make sure our ducks were in a row, that we knew the material would be available, that we could have time to teach the leaders and give them time to process so that they felt as comfortable as they could.
Lent often begins early in the year. So if you're planning to begin 3 to 4 months ahead of your launch with the planning, you need to start in October or November. This will give you the time you need to plan a small group campaign on the scale that we're talking about. You're going to want to build a leadership team. You'll want to make sure that you have thought through implications for budget. People need time to free up their schedules. 3 months out from launch, we will be building our leadership team. 2 months out, we'll be recruiting small group host homes. And 1 month out, we'll be recruiting the participants for the campaign. You can find out more details about what needs to be done at what point in the small group campaign manual. But the overall point that I want you to get from this video is set a God-sized goal and start early. One of the things that I think both of those pieces, one was me talking, of course, and expressing what we do in our congregation as we're about to launch a new initiative, and the other was Jim Servillo at the Church of the Ascension. What were some of the things that you picked up in that video? Alan?
Sorry, I didn't get unmuted quickly enough there. No, I think that just underscoring a lot of the things that we've talked about already, but I think the key is the part in your video of giving yourself enough time, that it doesn't need to be a rush, it doesn't need to be last minute. We have Lent every year, we have Easter every year. We're going to do something, so we might as well plan that and have those things in mind. And so I think giving yourself time to plan in advance, enough time to gather your team, enough time to begin to, recruit people who would be leading, to give them some training, and then enough time to allow, groups to start, to be formed. And then, with the ending of a year, the beginning of a year with Advent, people are looking to new things. And so it's kind of an ideal time in a lot of ways to be trying something new. But also just to be beginning to give that leadership and that thinking, and maybe even to get your own self up to speed of, what are some things that I need to be thinking about? What do I need to challenge myself with? And again, for those who are the senior leader in your church who are on this call, one of the things to think about is as you develop the team, we have another conversation where we talked about the team more thoroughly, but the idea of what Charlie was saying earlier about casting vision, that is your domain. But beyond that, to have other members of your staff, to have volunteers in your congregation to serve in a campaign team, then it's they're charged with caring for these leaders. They're charged with training leaders. And once you've cast vision for it and got it started in the right direction, even to have a campaign director, they should be able to follow along things that have been prescribed and then be able to take it from there. So that while there's a flurry of activity, it is also a lot of other people being engaged to serve in ways, so it doesn't all fall back on the senior leadership.
Right. So, one of the things that, I'm hoping to encourage some of you to be thinking about is the possibility of using a program that we've developed called the Christian Life Trilogy, which has a Lenten campaign called the Crucified Life. And so let's just take that for an example. If you're going to start to plan for that, Lent of 2016 comes pretty early. It comes at the beginning of February. So if you back up 3 months, and I tend to look at things pretty simple. So 3 months out, I would be planning the launch, building my leadership team, getting key leaders on board. 2 months out, I'll be recruiting the hosts that are going to host the small groups. And then 1 month out, I'll be working on participants. And the nice thing about Lent coming so early is you do get the advantage of that the Christmas Eve services, to where you can promote those small groups during the Christmas Eve services and say, hey, we've got something that you can come back to right at the beginning of the year. One of the things that I put on this particular slide is to, I know that this is a lot of information, and we are currently in session number 3 about setting your goal. But we're doing a series of webinars where we're going step by step through the thinking of how to build a campaign. We've already recorded these first 2 sessions, planning a launch and recruiting your campaign teams, and those are on the ChristianLifeTrilogy.com website. The setting your goal will be up there as a recording that you can use. And then we're going to be going through these particular topics, recruiting small group hosts, how to do that effectively, how to connect your congregation into the groups once you have the hosts set up, and then just giving some support to those hosts, how to coach them, how to bring new leaders on board, and some of the small group dynamics and basics. So this is the process that we use to get to 100%, and we're going to, over the next couple of months, be working through this to help train. So this is a good launch timeline where you have 12 weeks out, again, that leadership team, 8 weeks prior, small group hosts, and then 4 weeks prior, recruiting participants. And with Christmas Eve, that's a great opportunity for building up a small group program for Lent. I want to get to some of the questions that some of the people have asked here. We've got, does midweek worship services compete with the ability to have 100% participation? Is that a consideration? What would you say, a midweek teaching or a midweek worship service?
I would say that if there's a consistent group of people that are participating in midweek, and it's a benefit to them, this may be something to do during midweek, during the Lenten season, during the Easter season, but I wouldn't necessarily unplug it, for the sake of something else. And you know your people, you know how they're going to respond to that. So it's not a matter of, let's unplug, other things that we're offering and get them all into groups and do this. However, it could be an opportunity if you're wanting to make a change to start a change. It could be, to evaluate and say, well, why do people attend midweek? And if the response to that is, well, midweek may be the only other thing that we're offering beyond Sunday worship, well then, is it because it's midweek or because it's the only option? And so there are a few things to think through there, but I'm very cautious about, closing things down or making dramatic changes with people, because I don't want to necessarily volunteer for unnecessary trouble, if you will. I want to keep the focus on what we're trying to advance. If people are connected, if they're being taught in something that's not a small group, then if that's a valid thing and it's meeting a need, then maybe that's something that should continue. If it's a matter of, well, let's take a break from this because I would like to encourage, those who are in a midweek to open up their homes and do a group, but it's just going to be for one season, and people understand that may be worth a try, but I don't think it necessarily has to be an either or. I think it could be a both and.
Right, and in our congregation, we do have a lot of young families who value the midweek program where there's a youth group that's meeting and also a children's program. So that becomes where we have small groups actually meeting on our campus. We couldn't handle all the small groups meeting on our campus as a midweek Wednesday night thing, but by having 5 or 6 of them meet here, that provides free childcare, which for small groups is probably the biggest challenge for young families to participate in small groups, is what do you do with the children? And so that is one solution, is to have a midweek offering where you have some groups meeting at the facility and take advantage of a child care situation. Those are good things that you said too. Let me give a little bit of a commercial, and we'll get to some of the other questions. I want to encourage you to take a look. I sent, for just participating in the webinar, I sent you one study guide for the Christian Life Trilogy series, The Resurrected Life. And you'll be getting that in the mail sometime soon. But this is part of a larger small group study. There's 20 weeks of material, and it's designed to align the heart of the church around the heart of the church year. And the goal of the Christian Life Trilogy is to focus our hearts around the heart of the gospel and the things of first importance, which is the cross, the resurrection, and the outpouring of God's Holy Spirit. And so the crucified life is designed to go through the seven weeks. And if you start on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, it's a perfect curriculum to launch a small group program. And people are looking for things to do for Lent. And so even if you just did the crucified life and you didn't move on to the other two parts of the trilogy, and we had 40 congregations use these materials this past year, and some of them did that, just that. They stopped with the crucified life, but had tremendous impact and made the lead up to Easter and the Holy Week services and Good Friday especially poignant and meaningful, as people were well prepared by focusing on Jesus' 7 last words of the cross. The next launch time is actually after Easter. And so the resurrected life is written to be a study to do post-Easter. And then the Spirit-filled life is written to be done after Pentecost. What we did as a church is we used the crucified life for Lent, then we did the resurrected life after Easter, and then we did the Spirit-filled life as a fall program. And what that did is it provided a year's worth of material. There's 20 weeks of material. So a small group could get started, and they could be a new group, and by the time they got to the second series, that group had gelled. And those groups are now very strong and active as we're launching this year the Spirit-filled life at our church. These are materials that I wrote, and I wrote them because my own experience, I wanted small group materials that aligned with the heart of the church year and the heart of the gospel. And so I believe these are pretty unique materials, and they've been done to a high quality. If you're interested in them, you can look on the website. There's a way to see free samples of the first weeks of all of the different series and the videos and so on. And if you're really interested, what I would encourage you to do is to order that campaign kit, and you can get that for $50 off if you use that coupon code of Lent 2000 or Lent 16, which is right there, Lent 16. And I'll send you an email to that effect too, so that you can have that information. I want to just end with picking up some of these other comments and questions that we have. How do you deal with high dropout rates, Alan? Do you experience that with? Do we experience that with small groups where people participate maybe for one series and then they drop out of it? And what's your experience with that?
Well, I think what's true of anything is that life can get in the way. If you have good intentions for something and then stuff just happens, I think one of the things is to encourage leaders to follow up, because I think sometimes in a new leader's mind, when people haven't shown up for a week or two, the thought is, well, they haven't come back because they don't think I'm a very good leader. That's just human nature. That's how we think about things. And it could be that they have a child that was sick, or they had to work late, or something like that. And so to pick up the phone and to make that call, even though it's difficult, most people are not going to scream into the phone, "We're not coming back because you're a horrible group leader." You just follow up and say, "Hey, I'm not calling to, I'm not the truant officer. I'm not calling to get on to you, but just wanted to tell you we missed you last week. Is everything okay?" And if they say, "Oh yeah, well, my son, this happened, he's in the hospital." "Oh, well, can we pray for you? Can we bring meals?" So it could be an opportunity to serve. Now, I would say, as far as going from one series into the next to sustain groups, one of the things that we didn't do very well back in the days of 40 Days of Purpose is we had a lot of groups and a lot of momentum around a single series, and then at the end of the series, all the groups disbanded. And so I think to avoid that, the idea is to, in the middle of the series, for instance, in the Christian Life Trilogy, in the middle of the crucified life, to say, oh, by the way, if you enjoy meeting together and you would like to continue, after Easter, we're going to have another series called The Resurrected Life. And you want the group to make a decision about whether or not they're going to go forward before the current study ends. Because once the study ends, the group kind of disbands. It's hard to get them, pulled in back together. But if they make a decision before that study's over and say, yes, we want to continue and do the next series after Easter, and then, and then after Easter, do we do one in the middle of summer? Probably not going to do one until fall. But even if you announce, oh, by the way, the next series is going to be offered in the fall, because they have a next step and because they planned for it, they may do a little more group life during the summer, but they'll be right there in the fall ready to continue on with the next. It's not 100%. Some people, they can't continue. Things come up. They agree to do 6 weeks and they can't do anymore. And then you graciously thank them. But for most people, just, those encouragements on the group level of following up with people, see what's going on, see what happened. And then for the overall is to just make a decision in the middle of one series going into the next one.
That's good. One of the things also I would add to that, and what you're describing is exactly our experience, is that if you can encourage the small group to make a decision of what they're going to do next while they're still meeting, they will continue to meet. Another thing that you can add to that is to give the small groups one curriculum, or maybe even two, but give them something to do as a next step. They may decide not to use that curriculum as a group, but by giving them an option, because it's like when you go to to Barnes and Noble and you see a million different books on the shelf, you can get overwhelmed and not know which one to pick, and you spend a lot of time thinking about it. And by the time you've made your selection, you gotta leave. And the same thing happens when people start to look at all the different group studies that are out there. It can get very overwhelming. And so if you give them, as the pastor or the small group coach, our campaign director, one next step, that's enough to give them the confidence to say, yeah, we'll take the next step. And that is a helpful strategy too. Let me pick up one other question here. Is there a day of the week that facilitates more success towards 100% participation in your experience? And I'm not quite sure what that's getting at in terms of when the group should meet, maybe, or how would you read that?
I'm thinking that if it's up to the individual group meeting in a home, then the best day of the week is whatever day is going to work for that host. But I would say the other side of it would be, if you're saying, is there one day of the week that if you opened up the church for groups to meet and provided childcare, would one day be better than another? If your members are accustomed to coming midweek, then Wednesday might be the night. If you're in a community where a high number of your people commute any distance, I found with people that commute, groups tended to meet on Friday nights because they didn't have to get up early and go to work the next day, or they met on Sunday nights because they could meet maybe more in the late afternoon, early evening, and they typically didn't have other plans booked on Sunday night. So those would be some considerations depending on your community. So I'm assuming they're talking about what day of the week to open up the church. Now, if you live in the South, as your presenters do, I wouldn't plan anything on Saturday because it's all about college football, and the group's not going to happen. So
that's right.
That's true here anyway, Charlie. I don't know if it is for you or not.
That's very true. Gator football is very important down here. The other thing that I would add is that a lot of communities really respect Wednesday as a day for church. Not all communities, but definitely in some of the southern cities and communities and in other places, Wednesday night sometimes is more of a sacred night, and sports teams and schools and so on kind of expect that that's a church night. So that is a good night to have child care offered, because young families can often get off that particular night. Well, those are all the questions. Are there any other questions that any of that you have, or comments, or our participants have while we're still on? We have just about a minute left. Barring none, I want to just thank you, Alan, for being a good presenter, and thanks for your wisdom. And we'll look forward to talking with you again in about a month about the next topic.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be a part of this, and hopefully we've encouraged some folks. Maybe we've given them something to drive them to their knees and pray about. Now they're like, well, I was thinking about it, but now you guys scared me. Well, you know what? That's kind of a good place to be. And you never know what might come out of this. But I would just encourage the folks that are on this webinar today, if there's a bit of this that intrigues you, lean into that and find out a little more, take a step, and begin to dream about what might happen in your congregation. And I think you'll be very, very surprised in a good way.
Yeah, I would echo that, and we're in the faith business, so having a God-sized goal requires God-sized faith, and it does give us something to pray about. A lot of times maintaining is something that we do as churches and as clergy and church leaders and staff, and we don't want to take the risks of possibly giving ourselves a bigger workload or something else. So I do also want to encourage you to take the step of faith, and if there's ways that we can support and help, particularly through curriculum tools like the Christian Life Trilogy, or through coaching and encouragement, let us know, and we'll encourage you and help you. So thank you, and thanks for all the participants for being a part. It's important to us that you're on, and we're thankful for that. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Hi, my name is Charlie Holt, and I'm the pastor of St. Peter's Church and the author of the Christian Life Trilogy. Over the years, I've had a hunger to see solid small group materials developed in and around the core faith of our church, found in the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that He was buried, and that He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." The Christian Life Trilogy seeks to focus on the things of first importance: the crucified life, the resurrected life, and the Spirit-filled life. To explore what it means to walk the way of the cross, to be raised with Christ in newness of life, and to be filled with all the fullness of the Spirit of God. As a pastor, every year I'm asking myself, what am I going to do for Lent this year? Listen to the impact the Crucified Life materials have had on those who participated during Lent.
I think very often you look at the empty cross. You look at just the season of Lent. Here we go, another year. This gave people an opportunity to go deeper and to really find out, what does this mean? How does this apply to my life? What does this mean for my depth of spirituality?
To think of what Jesus was going through, it just made the Easter experience, the entire Easter experience, the most profound one I've ever had.
The average Christian, when he thinks about the last 7 phrases that Christ said on the cross, may take them at face value. But when we find out from this session on the crucified life, the meaning behind those words and how it applies to us, it definitely matures you as a Christian in a very strong way. I look at things totally different than I did before.
I think the crucified life really went to a place in people's lives where they're longing, but maybe don't even know they need. I've heard over and over again how God's touched people's lives and brought them to a deeper level of faith and intimacy with Christ through this Crucified Life series, and how our church as a community went through it together.
What you have just heard is the transformational power of the first study in the trilogy, The Crucified Life, 7 Words from the Cross. The entire Christian Life Trilogy is a 20-week journey into the heart of the gospel and the heart of the Christian life. These 3 studies are not only deeply theological in their intent and purpose, but also deeply practical as they call us to be transformed into the image and likeness of God through His Son, Jesus Christ.
Within just a couple of weeks, people were really sharing some of their biggest challenges, some of the toughest things that they're going through, and then watching other people in my group literally just wrap their arms around them, pray for them, and get involved in their lives. And that stuck and still sticks to this day. So that was, I think, what we needed, and that's what God did through the material.
God is calling the church back to His heart, and you're invited to be a part of that by participating in the Christian Life Trilogy church-wide campaign. I hope this resource will bring tremendous renewal to the church, your congregation, and to you personally. My prayer is that the Lord will bring all of our hearts back to the things of first importance as we walk the way of the crucified life, the resurrected life, and the Spirit-filled life.